Aviwe Mtila is currently in Poland. We do know that they were stuck in an aeroplane for over 26 hours. Aviwe, thanks so much for joining us. And I'm very interested to know why you're wearing that T-shirt, because there's a story behind it. The fact that you don't have access to your luggage and that journalists and what is believed to be the president's security personnel were unable to leave the aircraft for over 26 hours, and you don't have access to the luggage that was on that aircraft. Maybe just tell us about that, and then we'll move into what's currently happening in Russia.
Certainly, Heidi, I had to spend a few zlotys, in Poland, in Warsaw, to buy just essentials, change of clothing, your toothbrush, your toiletries, just to be able to be clean again after spending at least some 3 days in that chartered SAA Airbus, and of course spending at least over a day on Polish soil at the Chopin airport in Poland, but of course not being allowed to disembark from Thursday at around 1:30 p.m. up until Friday at around 3:30 p.m. That's some 26 hours later. Of course, the issue there was around the weaponry that the 120 or so personnel from the Presidential Protection Services that in fact are supposed to be with President Cyril Ramaphosa at this very moment in St. Petersburg in Russia were carrying. Allegedly, they didn't have the required documentation and the exact permits, in fact. But we heard from the General Wally Roda that that was not the case. And upon the request from the Polish authorities of the original documentation which they provided, then they switched up and spoke the original Polish language, which then caused a barrier in communication. They say that these were the racial undertones that they were met with. Not only that, Heidi, we understand one of the ambassadors, diplomats from the embassy here, from South Africa, in trying to get us out of that flight, was met with, the undertones of racism, told to strip down naked that female lady in front of the male Polish authorities. Some of what they were met with, of course, as they say that geopolitics are at play here. In fact, Heidi, just even coming here, we had an issue where we had to circulate around the Mediterranean Sea for hours on end because we weren't allowed into the Italian airspace. That had to be cleared out, in fact, before we were eventually allowed to continue with our route. And, of course, I just explained what we were met with in Warsaw. Ask me what then the 120 or so personnel are doing at this current moment. They're inside the hotel. They're playing pool table while we heard those very important speeches, of course, from the presidents. I understand the president of Russia just now gave his explanation of this conflict and why they decided then to, we understand, invade Ukraine. Also, we heard President Cyril Ramaphosa speaking on crucial points and how it impacts the African continent. You understand the food security issue there, where we, as the African continent, majority, a developing continent, receive the majority of our grain as well as the fertilizers from both Ukraine and Russia. So some of those conversations that you would expect to be circulating in those closed sessions would be how to open up those very corridors to enable, in fact, that grain and those fertilizers to go through to Africa. While it's not directly impacted by the war, while it's not in war, in fact, with Ukraine or Russia, it is directly impacted, even though it's about 1,000 or so kilometers away. I must say, Heidi, I'm grateful, in fact, that we got a chance to listen in to what the presidents are saying there, because we, on our Polish side here, are not in the loop in terms of what's happening there. In fact, we're told that there won't be any press conference on exactly what's going on there, as we saw the press conference, of course, where we saw the presidents explain themselves and their stance in that first leg of these peace talks, of course, of the AU delegates heading both to St. Petersburg, where they currently are in Russia, and also a bit earlier on, just yesterday, they were in Kyiv, Ukraine. As much as you heard some of what President Putin just suggested, why the reasoning behind the conflict now, dating back to even 2014, he suggests, we also heard the side of President Zelensky just yesterday, who suggests that, in fact, those missiles that were launched yesterday were a sign that, in fact, President Putin doesn't have a grip on the current conflict that's happening between Russia and Ukraine. In fact, talking on those very missiles, the headlines in Kyiv today are saying that the biggest liar in the world is the spokesperson of South Africa and the presidency. That would be Vincent Mangwenya. Of course, after that tweet that suggested that everything was rosy, there was nothing happening that was out of the ordinary in Kyiv yesterday, as those African states of heads, accompanied by some of the senior government officials from countries like Egypt, those that didn't send their presidents there, were in the country. Vincent Mangwenya suggested that everything was rosy and above board, but the headlines today are suggesting that he's the biggest liar in the world after, of course, there are those allegations of those missiles that were launched. We're hoping that, of course, this peace talk will give the perspective that the African continent itself is all for the peace and solving this conflict between Russia and Ukraine via peaceful means. Because, Heidi, at the end of the day, they have been dragged, trying to be pulled in one direction or the other, trying to take a stance or choose a side between the two countries. And if you look at the delegates that are actually heading there and the countries that are actually there, they don't actually sing in unison in terms of their stance on this particular conference. For example, if you look at Zambia, it's more leaning towards the Ukraine stance and more liberal in all of this. But if you look at Uganda and the delegation, of course, sent there, it's leaning towards the Russian stance. We have two powerhouses in Africa, both in the north and the south. We have Egypt and also South Africa there. Both of them not aligned and choosing, the peaceful resolution. But they're actually being accused, Heidi, of having, taking the side of the Russian stance. For example, in South Africa, we're accused of providing weapons to Russia via Lady R that docked down in South Africa. And in Egypt, they're accused of supporting Russia by allowing the Russian air military to travel via their airspace. So both of them accused of, taking the Russian stance. So this very peace-keeping mission would try to shield South Africa, not only South Africa, but the African continent, which you do understand is the biggest voting bloc when it comes to the UN General Assembly, trying to shield them in being drawn towards choosing one side or the other, but actually choosing peace in all of this and resolving whatever is happening in Russia in a peaceful manner.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you've touched on very important elements there. And it's interesting, though, that you touched on the issue of the food crisis, Aviwe, because the Russian president's indicating that the food crisis is not due to the special operation in Ukraine, and this is due to other factors and countries in Europe basically remaining the monopoly, and this all started back in 2020 due to COVID-19. So that's an interesting element there. But thank you so much for that update, Aviwe. I hope you get your luggage so that you can wear your very smart suits and formal shirts that I'm sure you've packed. Thank you so much for your time. That is, of course, Aviwe Mtila, who is out in Warsaw in Poland. We'll be back after the break, so do stay with South Africa Tonight.